Hello, this is Domenico with Easynomics, and we're going to use a monetarist macroeconomic model to illustrate the current rising inflation, demand pull, and cost push inflation that is being felt worldwide in the United States, North America, Europe. It's occurring globally, but for this video, we're going to focus on the US macro economy. If we look at the consumer price index, which is a weighted index that measures prices on average over time, we can see here that food prices have gone up about 11.4%. That is in part due to the Russian-Ukrainian war, restricting cereal grain wheat into the global market, causing scarcity and rising wheat and other cereal grain prices to rise. In addition, the Russian-Ukrainian war has also led to rising energy prices due to the scarcity of natural gas in the European Union and petroleum in global markets, leading to rising energy prices. And in the developed, in the industrial world, petroleum is a significant factor leading to rising prices for all goods, even if they may not be directly associated with petroleum, because they must be transported. So if gasoline prices rise, transportation costs rise, and whatever inputs and outputs are being transported will also increase. So in this chart, we can see that food and energy prices are a significant factor leading to the rising inflation being experienced in the United States. If we take out the food and energy prices, these volatile commodity prices, we see that we have the core rate of inflation being about 6%, which is still high. Remember that the Federal Reserve has a target rate of inflation of 2%. So let's dissect how these food and energy prices are rising. Again, in this chart, using a base year, in comparison to that base year, we can see how the rate of inflation or the price level is rising over time, relatively stable. And then from 2020 up till 2022, a dramatic rise in prices. That's in part due to the COVID and COVID lockdowns, restrictions in supply emanating or coming from manufacturing countries like China, and then the Russian-Ukrainian war, adding to rising gasoline prices and rising food prices. So we can see the supply shocks of the pandemic and the Russian-Ukrainian war has really led to an increase in this price index of goods and services in the United States. Below here, we have a little bit more information uh, highlighting that in August 2022, inflation's clocking in at about 8.3%, extremely high. The consumer price index, remember we're comparing it to the base year. Base year is usually a value of 100, going up to 296 compared to that base year. In addition, so what's contributing? We saw the higher energy prices. That's coming from, here we can see, rising crude oil prices over time. Here we see, that's going back to 2022, January, February. Here we have the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and then we have a spike in gasoline prices. They have fallen to $85 a barrel, but prior to that, going up to about $113 a barrel, that contributing to the rising energy prices. Wheat prices, we also see rising. Here's the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war, restrictions in the ability of Ukraine to export its cereal grains like wheat. So wheat prices spiking upwards, and that leading to rising global prices for any foods that use wheat as a key input. All right, and then we have also some supply shocks caused by China continuing to lock down cities due to its zero COVID policy. And if people are locked down in these particular cities, that leads to workers in China not being able to produce, manufacture, and EU, US firms that depend on inputs manufactured in China are not able to get those inputs, and that leads to supply shocks and cost push inflation. During the pandemic and as we exited the pandemic, We also had bottlenecks where we had a sudden increase in aggregate demand as we exited the pandemic, but still the impacts of COVID restricting supply in manufacturing countries such as China, and then trying to ramp up production quickly and not being able to do so. And we have cargo ships waiting to get to port to unload, but too many coming at the same time, and that leading to supply shocks within a nation like the United States. So supply shocks here, supply shocks with China's COVID lockdown, supply shocks with the rise in food prices, supply shocks with crude oil, all leading to, again, as we saw here, rising energy prices, rising food prices, predominantly caused by cost push inflation. But there's also some demand pull inflation. This is coming from the CARES Act during the pandemic, the United States government uh, engaging in a stimulus package of $2.2 trillion, expansionary fiscal policy, providing transfer payments to households receiving $1,200 and more. And we see that with the middle class that received these funds, most of it was saved and is now being spent as we exit the pandemic, thus leading to demand pull inflation. Uh, we see that with the beginning of the pandemic, the United States unemployment quickly shot up, but then quickly fell as we exited, and unemployment falling to kind of record lows below 4%. Again, a signal that we're entering an inflationary gap due to too much aggregate demand. Typically, the long run average level of unemployment in the United States is about 5%, and so we're below 4%. That should be a signal that we're entering an inflationary gap. In response to that, I'll be referring to this in my analysis. During the pandemic, the Federal Reserve Bank, the central bank, kept interest rates low to encourage people to borrow and spend. But due to the excessive demand pull inflation, we can see that the Federal Reserve is quickly increasing interest rates to slow down aggregate demand. And I'll talk about this in my next video, part 2 of this video. So let's go ahead and illustrate what's going on. Okay, so graph A will use the monetarist model, and we're going to illustrate the creation and elimination of an inflationary gap. On the y-axis, we're measuring the price level, and on the x-axis, real GDP. And next to that, I'm going to have the business cycle, just to illustrate how the monetarist model is a reflection of this business cycle. So I have points A, B, and C, which I'll be referring to in my monetarist model. The business cycle illustrates time on the x-axis and real GDP on the y-axis. So we have the boom and the bust cycle of any economy. A to B to C would be an inflationary gap, and then this downward curve here would be a recessionary gap, which I'll go over in my next video. And then we can collect all that data, unemployment data, GDP data, inflation data, and develop a trend line, here the long-term growth trend, or potential GDP, on average the amount of goods and services we are producing, and on average the level of unemployment and inflation within that economy. So let's go ahead and illustrate. So here we have our long-run aggregate supply curve, LRAS, and that long-run aggregate supply curve is the long-term growth trend, the potential GDP, the average level of goods and services that we should be producing. So I'll label this YP. Again, Y is equal to income in economics, and we assume in a closed circular flow model that income equals spending. Whatever you make is all that you spend, and the spending is equal to the output that you buy. So thus, Y is equal to real GDP. So we have the potential GDP. And the long run level of unemployment in the United States, in that growth trend, we see that unemployment is typically at about 5%, and perhaps inflation at about 2%, which I'll illustrate in just a second. So unemployment in the US, right, at 5% typically. All right, I'll say this is the full employment level, or the natural rate of unemployment. Okay. Then we'll have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Labeled AD1. And we have our upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve, labeled SRAS1. The intersection will be labeled right here. This will be point A, which is on our business cycle at this point here. So right here we have point A, and that sets the equilibrium level or the equilibrium price level, PL1. And we're going to say that the long-term level of inflation along this long-term growth trend is 2% inflation. Okay. So we would want to have inflation at 2% and at 5%. If we get those data points, unemployment 5%, 2% inflation, then we know that we're on the long-term growth trend and we're fully employing our factors of production, taking into account some unemployment, frictional, seasonal, structural. So here we are at point A. Let's say that perhaps we're exiting the pandemic and aggregate demand is rising from that recession into point A. We're reaching full employment. Unemployment's going to 5%. Fine. But as we continue to exit the pandemic, we see households continuing to spend money into the economy. And we want to remember that aggregate demand, if I have the space here, aggregate demand equals consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus, put here, exports minus imports. So as we exit the pandemic and the middle class that got that stimulus money, those transfer payments from the US central government, and they saved it during the pandemic and now have this disposable income that they can spend in things they would like to enjoy that they were not able to enjoy during the pandemic. So we started to see consumption spending rise. In addition, we saw that the interest rates were low during that time. So households are also being incentivized to borrow and spend. Perhaps they're buying new housing. That's a component of investment spending. That physical capital is investment spending. And because of the rising household spending, firms are also increasing their investment spending. So C and I are increasing, and that's leading to a level of demand pull inflation. So AD is increasing from 81 to 82. That leads to a higher price level in the short run, an equilibrium price level in the short run, PL2, and real GDP increasing from YP to Y inflation. And perhaps at this point, we're starting to see unemployment fall to about 3.9% approximately. This is an approximation. Again, we see with the unemployment data, it's falling below 4%. So I'll say it's 3.9. Okay. And let's say that the price level is rising to 4% due to that excessive aggregate demand. That causes firms to increase the quantity of their aggregate supply along their short-run aggregate supply curve. Costs of production are being held constant, wages, rent, interest, and profit. And the higher price level means that firms can gain more profit because the price level is greater than their marginal cost, which we can see here. That's the incentive for the firm to increase production. This is the price they're receiving on average, their marginal cost of production in the aggregate, and that becomes their rising profit margin with cost of production being held constant. So firms take on more factors of production like labor to increase the quantity of their aggregate supply. That explains why the unemployment rate is decreasing from 5 to 3.5%. And that leads us to a new equilibrium in the short run at point B. So in the business cycle, we're going from A to B. We're inside that inflationary gap. We're in that boom. Fine. In addition to that, we also have cost push inflation. We have the bottlenecks caused by the difficulty in manufacturing and other firms to ramp up production as we exit the pandemic. We also have China's continued use of strict COVID lockdown that prevents labor in China to go and work and produce and provide the inputs and outputs needed by firms in other regions of the world. We have the Russian-Ukrainian war adding to rising food prices, the Russian-Ukrainian war adding to rising petroleum and natural gas prices. So all of that contributing to this cost push inflation that we see here with food and energy. So we can illustrate that. So SRS is rising. Costs of production are increasing. From SRS 1 to SRS 2. Now, as firms compete for resources from A to B, they're trying to increase their production and they find less and less available labor, firms will be more willing to offer higher wages to attract the remaining units of labor. If wages go up, that's a cost of production, that will cause SRS to increase. If food and gasoline prices rise, those are additional costs of production. So all of that, the rising wages, the rising gasoline and natural gas prices, the rising food prices, all causing the SRS curve to shift inwards or upwards. That is cost push inflation. So that leads to an even higher price level. So here we have prices on average going up to PL3. And inflation rising in the United States, potentially up to 8%. Now, as the cost of production rise, firms will be unable to employ the needed resources due to their fixed financial resources. And so they're going to have to reduce their supply curve, as we see here, SRS1 to SRS2. And with these rising costs of production, they're going to price their outputs higher at PL3. The higher output prices will lead to households reducing the quantity of their aggregate demand along the 82 curve from point B to point C. All right, so now we're on the downward trend of the inflationary gap, and we're going back to full employment. So when households begin to reduce the quantity of their aggregate demand due to the higher price level, firms will also reduce the quantity of outputs they're producing and also reduce and fire the excess resources that they don't need, land, labor, capital, which will explain why unemployment would be falling, increasing back to its natural rate of 5%. Okay, so that is what is currently occurring. We have both demand pull and cost push inflation contributing to the rising prices that we're all experiencing in the global economy. I'm going to go ahead and analyze this, but in part 2 of this video series, we're going to look at what is the Federal Reserve, the central bank, trying to do, and what the impact of that is going to be. And that will be recession. You're hearing a lot of talk about potential global recession in the next year, but that's for the next video. So I'm going to analyze this as we would for a paper exam. As can be seen, we have two graphs. Graph A illustrating the monetarist model, which is an inflationary gap, the creation and elimination of an inflationary gap. We're measuring the real GDP on the x-axis, price level on the y-axis. Graph B is the US business cycle. On the y-axis, we're measuring real GDP, and on the x-axis, we're measuring time in years. With the business cycle, we have an upward sloping long-term growth trend reflective of the potential GDP, the average amount of outputs that we're producing when we fully employ our resources. And this cycle highlights that every economy experiences both inflationary and recessionary gaps. In the monetarist model, we have a perfectly inelastic long-run aggregate supply curve, which is reflective of the long-term growth trend, the potential GDP. Thus, LRS is full potential GDP, YP. We have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve labeled AD1, downward sloping according to the wealth effect, interest rate effect, international trade effect, and we have an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. Upward sloping because firms are incentivized to increase their output when the price level is greater than their marginal costs. We're at 81. Let's see if I can make a few notes here. We're at 81 equals SRAS1 equals LRAS. That provides an equilibrium level of GDP at YP, and an equilibrium price level at PL1. Here we're fully employing our resources. We're at the natural rate of unemployment in the United States at about 5%, and inflation is at about 2%. That is point A. Due to the central government of the United States providing stimulus checks to households, lower income households receiving it and spending it on necessities, middle income households saving those funds and then spending those funds as we exit the pandemic, that will lead to rising aggregate demand for vacation holidays, perhaps new automobiles, and also due to the lower interest rates by the Federal Reserve, households are borrowing and spending on new housing, which is a component of investment spending. We see that consumption and investment spending is increasing. That is a determinant that's going to cause 80 to shift out from 81 to 82. That sets a new equilibrium where 82 equals SRAS, RAS 1, and we see that these two are now greater than the LRAS curve, signaling that we're entering an inflationary gap. Real GDP increases to Y inflation, and the price level increases to PL2. The rising price level incentivizes firms to increase the quantity of their aggregate supply from point A to point B, or from YP to Y inflation. Thus, they will begin to employ more resources, like labor. The unemployment rate thus falls from 5% to 3.9%. As we enter that inflationary gap, assuming that labor is becoming scarcer, firms wanting to acquire the less units of labor will begin to offer higher wages. Wages is a cost of production that will cause the SRAS curve to start to increase as a result. But also because of the Russian-Ukrainian war causing rising gasoline prices, energy prices, food prices. If they are inputs in production, it would also cause SRAS to shift up by that amount or shift in by that amount, which is cost push inflation. So SRAS shifts in from SRAS 1 to SRAS 2. That sets a new equilibrium at point C with a higher price level at PL3 and GDP falling from Y inflation to YP. The higher price level causes households to restrict the quantity of their aggregate demand from point B to C, or from Y inflation to YP. Here we're on the downtrend of the inflationary gap until we reach the new long-run equilibrium at point C. Okay. So hopefully here, just make a note, 82 at the end equals SRAS2, which is equal to LRAS. All right, we have the new price level at PL3 with real GDP back at YP. So here we can see the connection between A, B, and C, the inflationary gap and the inflationary gap on the business cycle. In the next video, we'll look at what's to come, what will happen in 2023. Unfortunately, we're going to a recessionary gap, and we're going to try to understand how and why in that next video. If you have any questions, feel free to comment those questions below, and don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.